Today was a very bad day for Finesse2Tymes. And the reason I'm saying that has nothing to do with album sales, streaming numbers, or whether he dropped a hit record this week. The reason people are looking at Finesse2Tymes differently right now is because it feels like the conversation around him has completely changed. There was a time when every discussion involving Finesse2Tymes was about his comeback story. People talked about how he came home from prison and immediately turned his life around. They talked about how he rebuilt his career from the ground up and became one of the hottest artists coming out of Memphis. They talked about his work ethic, his grind, and his ability to overcome obstacles that would have broken most people. But lately, that's not what people are talking about anymore. Instead, every time his name trends online, it seems like the discussion revolves around controversy, drama, and problems involving the people around him. And whether that's fair or unfair, it's creating a situation where more people are paying attention to the chaos surrounding Finesse2Tymes than the actual music he's making. Now, before anybody misunderstands what I'm saying, let's be clear about one thing. Finesse2Tymes has accomplished something that very few artists ever accomplish. This is somebody who spent years dealing with legal troubles and prison sentences before finally getting an opportunity to restart his career. Most artists disappear after a setback like that. Most artists never get another chance to prove themselves. But somehow Finesse2Tymes came home, immediately built momentum, signed major deals, released successful music, and became one of the most recognizable voices in Southern hip-hop. That's why so many fans supported him from the beginning. People weren't just buying into the music. They were buying into the story. They were buying into the idea that somebody could completely change their life, overcome their past mistakes, and build something bigger than what people expected. And because fans became emotionally invested in that comeback story, every controversy that appears now feels bigger than it normally would. The biggest issue facing Finesse2Tymes right now isn't necessarily one specific incident. It's the fact that controversy keeps finding its way back into the conversation. Over the last year, social media has been flooded with discussions about people connected to him, situations involving members of his camp, and drama that has absolutely nothing to do with making music. Instead of fans debating which song is better or which project is his strongest work, they're debating loyalty, leadership, bad decisions, and whether the people around him are helping or hurting his career. That's a dangerous place for any artist to be. Because once the public starts associating your brand with drama instead of success, every new headline becomes another piece of evidence supporting a narrative that may or may not even be true. The problem isn't one controversy. The problem is when people begin connecting all the controversies together and creating a larger story about who they think you are. And that's exactly where Finesse2Tymes seems to find himself today. The internet has reached a point where every new issue gets added to a growing list of previous issues. Fair or unfair, that's simply how social media works. Nobody evaluates situations individually anymore. People collect screenshots, old clips, old interviews, old accusations, old arguments, and combine them into one giant narrative. Once that narrative starts spreading, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. Suddenly, people aren't saying, this is one bad situation. They're saying, this is another bad situation. And that single word, another, changes everything. Because it suggests a pattern. It suggests repetition. It suggests that problems keep showing up over and over again. Whether that's true or not almost becomes irrelevant because public perception starts operating independently from reality. Now here's where the situation starts becoming even more complicated for Finesse2Tymes. Because when you really sit back and look at everything that's happened over the last year, you start to realize that the biggest problem isn't necessarily any single controversy. The biggest problem is the amount of attention those controversies are receiving. Every successful artist deals with criticism. Every successful artist deals with rumors. Every successful artist eventually finds themselves in situations where people question their decisions. That's normal. What isn't normal is when those conversations become more popular than the music itself. And that's exactly what many fans have started noticing. Instead of talking about records, projects, performances, and career moves, people are spending more time discussing drama, loyalty, internal conflicts, and the people connected to Finesse2Tymes. That's never a position an artist wants to be in, because once the public begins focusing more on the distractions than the product, it becomes increasingly difficult to control the narrative. Suddenly, every interview becomes about controversy. Every live stream becomes about drama. Every social media post becomes an opportunity for people to revisit old issues. And before long, the artist finds himself trapped in a cycle where the music becomes secondary to everything else happening around him. What's even more interesting is how quickly public opinion can change. Not long ago, Finesse2Tymes was being celebrated as one of the best comeback stories in hip-hop. People admired his journey. They respected the fact that he had overcome obstacles that would have completely destroyed most careers. Fans were inspired by his story because it represented redemption, growth, and perseverance. But the internet has a very short memory when it comes to success and an extremely long memory when it comes to controversy. That's why some fans have started expressing frustration. Their frustration isn't necessarily coming from hatred. In many cases, it's coming from disappointment. They want to see him win. They want to see him focus on building his legacy. They want to see him capitalize on the opportunities he's worked so hard to earn. Instead, they feel like unnecessary drama keeps pulling attention away from the things that matter most. Whether those criticisms are fair or unfair is open for debate, but the fact that they're becoming more common is something that shouldn't be ignored. Another major issue people have been discussing is leadership. Whenever an artist reaches a certain level of success, fans naturally begin holding them to a higher standard. People stop viewing them as just another rapper and start viewing them as a leader, a businessman, and somebody responsible for the environment they've created around themselves. That's why so many conversations surrounding Finesse2Tymes eventually come back to the same question. Is he surrounding himself with the right people? Because whether we like it or not, the people around us often influence how the world perceives us. If your team is constantly making headlines for positive reasons, that reflects well on you. If your team constantly finds itself surrounded by controversy, people eventually begin associating those controversies with you as well. That's simply how public perception works. The audience doesn't separate the artist from the circle. They see everything as part of one larger brand. And right now, many people believe that brand is facing challenges that have nothing to do with music. The problem with public perception is that once a narrative begins spreading, it becomes incredibly difficult to stop. Every new controversy gets viewed through the lens of previous controversies. Every misunderstanding becomes evidence supporting an existing narrative. Every disagreement becomes another reason for critics to say, "See, this is exactly what we've been talking about." That's why reputation is so valuable. Building a strong reputation can take years of hard work, consistency, and positive decisions. Damaging that reputation can happen much faster. It doesn't necessarily happen because of one major mistake. Sometimes it happens through a series of smaller situations that slowly change how people view you over time. That's why some fans are worried. They're not worried because they think Finesse2Tymes can't recover. They're worried because they understand how quickly narratives can take hold in today's internet culture. At the same time, it's important to remember that criticism doesn't automatically mean failure. In fact, many successful artists have faced periods where people questioned their decisions, criticized their behavior, or doubted their future. The difference between artists who survive those moments and artists who don't often comes down to how they respond. Some artists allow the negativity to consume them. Others use it as motivation. They become more focused. They become more disciplined. They use criticism as fuel rather than allowing it to become a distraction. That's why many supporters remain optimistic about Finesse2Tymes. They believe he's still capable of changing the conversation. They believe he's still capable of reminding people why they became fans in the first place. And most importantly, they believe the music is still strong enough to shift the focus back where it belongs. The business side of the situation is also worth discussing because controversy doesn't just affect public opinion. It can affect opportunities. Promoters pay attention to headlines. Brands pay attention to public perception. Business partners pay attention to risk. That's not unique to Finesse2Tymes. That's true for every public figure. Companies want predictability. Investors want stability. Event organizers want positive publicity. When an artist becomes associated with repeated controversy, some opportunities can become more complicated. Again, that doesn't mean opportunities disappear entirely. It simply means people begin asking more questions before making decisions. And in an industry where perception often matters just as much as reality, those questions can have significant impact. What's fascinating about this entire situation is that it feels like Finesse2Tymes is standing at an important crossroads in his career. On one path, he can continue allowing the conversation to be dominated by controversy, distractions, and unnecessary drama. On the other path, he can redirect the focus back toward music, business, and long-term success. The reason this moment matters is because fans are paying attention. Critics are paying attention. The industry is paying attention. Everybody wants to see what happens next. Everybody wants to know whether this period becomes a temporary setback or the beginning of a larger problem. Those are two very different outcomes, and the decisions made over the next several months could play a major role in determining which direction things go. The reality is that Finesse2Tymes still has something many artists would love to have. He still has attention. People still care. People are still talking about him. People are still interested in what happens next. That means the opportunity to change the narrative still exists. The challenge is figuring out how to do it. Because once the audience starts expecting drama, you have to give them something bigger and more compelling to focus on. For an artist, that usually means delivering results. Great music changes conversations. Successful projects change conversations. Smart business moves change conversations. Positive headlines change conversations. The question now is whether Finesse2Tymes can create enough positive momentum to overpower the negativity that currently surrounds him. That's why many people are saying today was a very bad day for Finesse2Tymes. Not because his career is over. Not because he's finished. Not because there's no way back. The reason people are saying that is because the pressure continues building. The scrutiny continues increasing. The criticism continues growing louder. And for the first time in a long time, it feels like more people are discussing the problems surrounding Finesse2Tymes than the accomplishments that made him successful in the first place. That's never where an artist wants the conversation to be. The good news is that narratives can change. The bad news is that changing them requires action. And right now, all eyes are on Finesse2Tymes to see what that action will be.